The Association of the U.S. Army is pleased to welcome you to AUSA's Thought Leaders Webinar Series, a new webinar series featuring military leaders and contemporary military authors. Kicking off today's webinar is AUSA's Vice President of Education, Lieutenant General Guy Swan.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Association of the United States Army's Thought Leaders Webinar Series. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion. And while we wish we could all be together at AUSA, that's simply not possible at this time. So we've created a series of events to bring you senior Army leaders, authors, and other personalities speaking on topics of current interest to America's Army, all in a live and interactive forum. We're very glad you've joined us today, and we much appreciate your support as partners in the defense of our great nation. Joining us today to discuss their new book are Lieutenant General retired Dave Barno and Dr. Nora Bensahel. They're the authors of Adaptation Under Fire: How Militaries Change in Wartime. And I have to say, this is one of the most extensively researched and documented work on this important topic that I certainly have ever seen. We're also joined today by Lieutenant General retired James Dubik, who will moderate today's discussion. Jim is a senior fellow here at AUSA and also a senior fellow at the Institute for the Study of War. He is a well-known thinker and writer in the area of military affairs in his own right. He's the author of Just War Reconsidered: Strategy, Ethics, and Theory, and is a frequent contributor to Army Magazine here at AUSA, which is our flagship publication. So with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to our good friend, General Dubik. Sir.
So thank you, Guy, for that kind introduction, and Dave and Nora, very good to see you. Of course, we all look forward to the time when we can be together and talk about this. Let me start with a pitch for the book. It is a very good book. It's a very good read, very thoughtful, well documented, well researched. It weaves together the story of innovation or not with a framework that is very enlightening. So if you haven't had a chance to buy the book and read the whole thing, please do so. It is well worth your time, and it will provoke reflection, which is the best thing that any author could hope for. So Dave, Nora, let me turn it over first to you before we go to questions for a brief description and introduction to the book. Dave, over to you.
Well, thanks, Jim, and it's great to be here today, and our thanks to AUSA for giving us the opportunity to talk about our book in this format. This is a great window to reach a large number of AUSA members out there. This book is very much about land forces, so it's a perfect fit for this audience in many respects, and we're very excited to have the opportunity to talk about it here today. Dr. Bensahel and I will kind of split our pitch here up front, and then we'll look forward to your questions, and we hope to animate the majority of the time hearing what you've got to say and perhaps responding to thoughts and questions you might have based on our presentation on the book. So we wrote this book because we felt that the U.S. military perhaps had a challenge in the domain of adaptation, that wars always require adaptation for militaries to be successful, and oftentimes they fall short. Militaries are in the business of preparing for wars, but inevitably those wars don't unfold in quite the ways that they may anticipate. Former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates was fond of saying that since Vietnam, the United States had a perfect record of predicting the next war. We've never once gotten it right. And it's a fair possibility that that trend is going to continue well into the future. But despite that, militaries have to make decisions. They have to decide what kind of weaponry they're going to acquire. They have to draw up budgets. They've got to train their personnel and establish doctrine of how they anticipate they're going to fight. And they've got to develop their leaders to be able to go onto that uncertain battlefield and dominate it. And that is a huge challenge for us. But at the end of the day, as famous British historian Michael Howard once said, it's not so matter that militaries have got it fundamentally wrong going into the war. That may be less important than what really matters, according to Michael Howard, was the capacity of militaries to get it right when the moment arrives. In other words, can militaries actually adapt to the situation at hand in front of them, despite whatever doctrine, technology, leadership they brought into that conflict? And we'll talk a little bit more about each of those. And so as we looked at this, we thought that, in fact, there's going to be a requirement to continue to plan, to continue to prepare. And the U.S. military is extraordinarily good at that. Develops plans, contingencies, exercises, and relentless, realistic training that prepares the U.S. military probably for the next conflict as well as could be possible. But at the same time, we think there's a requirement to become much more adaptable. Why is that? One of the reasons is that we believe that there's now what we characterized in our book as an adaptability gap, and that gap is growing in the era that we're in right now. We define the adaptability gap as the distance essentially between the war that you expect, which is perhaps at 12 o'clock on the clock face, and the war that actually arrives, which historically has maybe been at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock. And you've had to span that spectrum between the expected war at high noon and the real war at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock. We think today that gap is growing, that instead of the distance between 12 and 3 being as much as you have to change your approach to war when the war actually unfolds, now it may be like 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock. And there's a number of factors we think that are contributing to that huge change in the amount of adaptation that may be required by military. First, we'd say we're in a period here for the United States of great strategic uncertainty. We're no longer in a bipolar world. We're no longer in a unipolar world. We're in a world now where we're facing great power competitors once again in Russia and China. We're having to think about regional threats that are still very serious and dangerous. North Korea, Iran come to mind. And we're having to deal with the rise of non-state actors and even state actors that are operating in the gray zone, those so-called hybrid wars where we're in the fuzzy area between war and peace that fall below the thresholds that would normally trigger a defensive response, an alliance response, or armed conflict. So this is a period where militaries are facing changing character of war, a different kind of war than what they may have expected in the past, even when it's great power competition. We also think that there are, and are clear that there are several new domains of war of which we've got no history of fighting in. Since our last major global conflict, and even since the Cold War, we now see the rise of cyberspace and outer space as new domains of conflict that are going to be extraordinarily central to any future major power war in any possible imagination of that scenario. We've also seen the evolution of the biological space here, even with the pandemic that we're facing right now, and we've seen what catastrophic results that has inflicted on the homeland here. So the idea that there are new domains that we don't have any good history or lessons learned for, and that we really haven't fought in before, that in the case of both cyberspace and of outer space are now central to our military operations, yet we don't have an experience of how to defend those, how to attack in those, what war in those domains might look like. That's making war very unclear, very uncertain, suggesting that we're going to have to make some major adaptations. We're also in a time, frankly, of exponential change in all other realms of society, and business and finance and social media. It took 38 years, for example, for radio to reach 50 million people around the world. Facebook did that in 1 year, and Pokemon Go did that in just a few days. So our ability to influence large audiences out there and to have them play a role in future conflicts is just one significant reflection of how much exponential change is going on and how our world is changing far more rapidly than we've ever seen before as we've anticipated conflicts in the past. That also is affecting military technological change. We're seeing huge leaps ahead in weaponry and capabilities, in the role of the internet, and as I mentioned, in cyberspace and space domains in ways that we've not experienced in warfare before. Hypersonics, autonomous weapons, drones, robotics, ultimately quantum computing and AI are going to play significant roles in warfare, again, that aren't part of our playbook, aren't part of our history, aren't part of wars that we've studied or learned about or even experienced in the past. So all these, we think, are going to drive the U.S. military to have to think very creatively about not only how to anticipate what that future is going to look like, but to recognize that they're going to be surprised, that there's going to be a distance to be covered, that gap is growing, and the ability of the U.S. military to move from what it expected very rapidly into what's actually out there in ways that may be very, very much different than what was anticipated is going to be crucial. So the fundamental question of our book basically is the U.S. military adaptable enough to prevail in these wars of the future? And so to talk about that a little bit more and open that door further for you, I'm going to turn it over to my partner in crime here and co-author, Dr. Nora Bensahel.
Great, thank you very much for that, and I'm delighted to be here today with all of you as well. So let me talk a little bit about how we seek to answer that question, right? That's the question that motivated the book. Is the US military adaptable enough for all of these challenges that General Barno just mentioned? We divide the book into three parts. The first part defines what we mean by adaptation, because if we don't define the terms, then we don't know exactly what we're talking about. We develop a framework based on three important elements. The first is the role of doctrine in adaptability. A doctrine, as many of you know, is essentially how a military fights. It reduces the uncertainty and fog of friction of war, and so the doctrine being able to keep up with what's happening on the battlefield is a very important dimension of adaptability. The second part of the framework is adaptability in technology, and we look at that at two levels. We look at it at the tactical level, how troops on the battlefield use technologies that they already have at hand in order to fight better on the battlefield and to use those in new and unexpected ways when challenges arise. And we look at it at the institutional level, how the military as a whole develops and procures new weapons that might be needed for the fight. The third and probably most important part of our framework is the role of leadership. And again, we look there at two levels. Tactical leadership, we look at those who are responsible for fighting and winning on the battlefield itself. And at the theater level, we look at the generals who craft and implement campaigns, who are usually the most senior person located in the theater of war. We illustrate what we mean in each of those examples in each of those elements with examples from the 20th century, starting with World War I and going all the way up through Vietnam, the Yom Kippur War, and the invasion of Grenada as examples. The second part of the book focuses on the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that is the largest chunk of the book, which has many detailed examples, and we're happy to answer any questions you might have about that in the Q&A session. But our findings can briefly be summarized as follows. We found that adaptability was really very impressive at the tactical level most of the time. We have case studies in the book of how Apache helicopter pilots adapted their tactics to provide close air support with a helicopter that was originally designed for deep attack, a very, very different mission. And on the leadership side, we look at the example of then Colonel Sean McFarland in Ramadi, who implemented a counterinsurgency strategy that helped turn the tide of the Iraq War overall. We found, though, that at the institutional level and theater level, there were some really abysmal failures in adaptation that really challenged how the wars unfolded and ultimately their prospects for success. In the section on institutional technology, we looked at the US Army's refusal to provide its soldiers with intelligence software provided by the company Palantir, which the Marines had used to save lives and demonstrated its effectiveness in theater in order to bureaucratically protect its preferred system, which is known as D6A. And in Iraq, we look at the example of General George Casey, who was the theater commander from 2004 to 2007. And during his 4-year tenure, he never reevaluated some of the most basic assumptions of the war, even as every possible metric got worse. The third section of the book looks towards the future, using the examples from history and the examples from the recent wars. We get back to that fundamental question about whether the US military is adaptable enough for the challenges that it will face in the future. And this is where we argue that the answer to that question may well be no. We start by discussing the challenges of future war and many of the challenges that General Barno mentioned earlier in our presentation. We then assess the current state of US military adaptability in each of those three areas and find numerous causes for concern. In doctrine, we find that there's often excessive amounts of it, and the processes of revising it to account for current circumstances are way too slow. In the area of technology, we identify some structural tensions between the combatant commands, which prioritize the needs of today's fighters, and the services, which are tasked with organized training and equipping the future force and prioritize needs for the future. And in the area of leadership, we identify too much risk aversion within the force, especially when in garrison, and some problems with professional military education that we think need to be solved. The final chapter concludes with about 20 different specific recommendations that can be implemented in order to improve adaptability. And just as a few examples, we recommend adopting adaptability as a principle of war. We recommend strengthening mission command, especially in garrison, and we recommend sending more officers to advanced civil schooling in addition to the professional military education that they receive, and we have some recommendations on improving that and making that more rigorous as well. With that, we'll stop. We've given you a good overview of our work and our concerns about U.S. military adaptability into the future, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
No, thanks, Nora. Thanks, Dave. As you were summarizing the book, I was reflecting on how much I enjoy reading it, and so thanks for that summary. We have a few questions, but I wanted to start by asking you about that adaptability gap. Either of you or both of you. As I was reading, I was wondering whether there was a temporal dimension to this adaptability gap. If you look at past wars, not just 20th century, go back to even the Civil War, the Union didn't get its act together till 1863. That's 3 years into the war, 2+ anyway. You look at World War II, it's the same way, from Pearl Harbor, about 1942, late 42, 43, before we get our act together. Vietnam was the same kind of thing. Afghanistan and Iraq. Some might say we got our act together in 2007 and 8 in Iraq. Maybe not. Maybe we got our act together in Afghanistan, but there are years in our history of this adaptability under fire. And I wonder, given what you, Dave, said about the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and Nora, what you were talking about in terms of leadership being so important, can we close the temporal gap as well as the adaptability gap, or are they intertwined? Are they related, or are they separate?
I think one of the dangers is that, and this is based on the reality that we're now in a period of such exponentially rapid change, that the amount of time that the United States has to react and to adapt and to get better and to learn, that you described in World War II, several years, in Iraq, a couple of years as well, that may be disappearing, and that we may find that we've got even less time to adapt than we have in the past. We've always had the benefit of a relatively slow moving situation to be able to respond to what the enemy was going to do. World War II, with the ocean separating us from the adversaries, we were in a different position than France was, which we use as one of our examples, which was overrun in 6 weeks by the Germans. If they had time to adapt, it was no more than 6 weeks. And by that time they had lost. And so in the book, we argue that one of the challenges the United States is going to face is that we are always going to have an enemy that has a first mover advantage, that our adversaries out there, because they are going to be the aggressors almost by definition, are going to move first. And if they have a knockout blow at the very beginning that we simply can't adapt to because there's not enough time, that's a grave risk. So I think your point's a great one, to the extent also that we just don't have the amount of time available, or shouldn't expect to have the time available in future conflicts that we've grown very accustomed to in the past.
Well, we have a question concerning your recommendations. Your last chapter has a whole lot of really thought-provoking suggestions on how we could get at adaptability. If there were the top 3 of your list, that perhaps the chief would call you in and say, look, I can probably push through 2 or 3 of your initiatives. Which do you think would have the biggest bang for the buck of pushing it through?
I'll start with that. One of the recommendations I think that is the most important is the one about improving professional military education and promoting advanced civilian schooling, as I mentioned. And I think that those are 2 of the most critical ones, because being able to adapt in the future environment, given its complexity and given the speed at which everything is going to unfold, is going to require leaders to think incredibly creatively, to come up with outside of the box solutions, and to do so under enormous time pressure and military pressure. And so the education and officer development process that helps them, particularly at the more senior levels, since those are the areas where we identified the most problems in US military adaptability, we think are very, very important. We think that the curricula at the war colleges needs to become more rigorous with more detailed writing assignments in particular. I know that's not popular for anybody in the force, but we think that's extremely important. And that the curriculum focus more on exercises and role playing in addition to what they currently cover to give people practice in adapting quickly to unforeseen situations. We also think that sending more officers to civilian graduate school as a complement to their PME programs is really important, because there's limits on the diversity of thinking that can go on at the war colleges just by its very population. The war colleges do a very good job of bringing in international fellows, people from all of the services, and sometimes a few senior defense civilians, sometimes from state or USAID. But most of the people in the classroom are military. They think the same way. They've had the same life experiences. And being able to go into a civilian classroom where you have 22-year-olds who've never met anyone in the military, with professors who've been thinking about these issues for their careers, is really a very important part of challenging their worldview, getting them to think more broadly, and really preparing them to think in an entirely different way as they take on the responsibilities that their ever more senior positions require.
Yeah, I think I would certainly endorse that. And I think we both feel pretty strongly that leader development may be the critical component of this. You know, you're going to have all kinds of multiple challenges in your doctrine development and change process and technology and adapting that. But if you have leaders that simply aren't up to the task and that aren't actually deeply steeped in the requirements to adapt in their development over the course of their career, then you're ultimately going to fail. So those two recommendations, I think, are very good ones. I think the other thing I would highlight is that we need to be much more tough on our forces in terms of our exercise program. And I don't mean this to be, the National Training Center is just not tough enough on those battalion task force commanders or brigade combat team commanders. We do that quite well. And we are very good about near free play out there and putting our soldiers and our leaders in very challenging environments. And I particularly applaud the Army for having pioneered that back in the 1980s, that has actually been taken on now by virtually all the other services. We don't do that as well, I don't think, at the joint level, and we don't do that as well as the major unit exercise and experimentation. So putting forces, now joint forces in particular, in environments and exercises that may be virtual simulations or some combination of that with a live exercise that brings them to the point of failure, that shuts down their systems, that gives them, confronts them with challenges from the adversary that they did not expect and aren't part of their playbook. We don't do that nearly as well as we do it down at the tactical level in our service in the U.S. Army. And so I think that area is one where we need to find out where our seams and flaws are and push people to discover those and into the breaking point of our doctrine or our approach here in peacetime now, before we get into another major conflict. The other thing I think we need to do is we've got to condition people to be used to being surprised, that we basically build a lot of our training and a lot of our exercises and a lot of our con plans and op plans for taking out all of the different contingencies that could happen, so that we rarely encounter situations in training where we're flat out surprised. And I think we need to instill that into our development leaders, whether that's in the classroom at the War College or Command and Staff College, where totally unexpected things happen. You have to deal with that surprise and the unexpected, or out there in the live and virtual training environment. So again, perhaps both of those are different facets of the same issue of how do you make sure people are used to being adaptable and used to being surprised, and measure their capability against that in some way.
Well, Nora, I got to say thanks for the flashback. I went from the 2nd Ranger Battalion to the philosophy department at Johns Hopkins in 1979, and it was a worldview shaking experience, no doubt about it. So thanks for that memory. I want to keep going on this leader development, though, stuff that both Nora and Dave, you talked about. It seems like you document very well the tactical level adaptability and document pretty well the slowness of the institutional and theater level adaptability. What happens? They're the same guys. What happens between the really adaptable people and the not so adaptable people? So that's one aspect. The other aspect is at the senior levels for the adaptability at the theater level and adaptability at the institutional level. The services are not lone actors. If you pick out some portions of our history when we adapted well, Congress was involved. And I think you have to say there was at least sufficient alignment among the departments in the executive branch. So I wondered from your perspective, what happens to the good guys, to the other guys as we develop? And then second, how do we involve Congress more? What can we do better to involve Congress to align the executive branch behind this stuff? And allies, I think that's another aspect. We can learn from our allies a little in this regard. So over to you two.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that it's the people who were once very adaptable at the tactical levels that become perhaps not as flexible, not as adaptable at the more senior levels. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. When you get into the more senior levels, part of it is that you take on the view of wherever you are in the bureaucracy on a staff. Much of the time. And that certainly is the case when we look at our examples of the failures of technology at the institutional levels. The folks at the most senior levels of the service were highly invested in their programs of record, did not want to admit that there were problems with them, and did everything they could to prevent alternatives from being explored. So part of it is, that focus on protecting your own bureaucratic interests that I think comes naturally sometimes in those more senior positions. But I also think that the type of adaptability that you need to have at the tactical level is very, very different than what you need at those higher levels, at the institutional level or at the theater level. And being able to adapt to an ever-changing adversary where you've had a tremendous amount of training, again, as General Barno said, at the National Training Center, at the JRTC, all of those wonderful experiences that really drill that in. There's nothing comparable for that at the higher levels. And very often what adaptability at the highest levels requires is taking your playbook and everything that you've learned in your experience and either throwing it out or at least questioning the basic assumptions that may have been there throughout your entire career unchallenged. And that takes an incredible amount of energy and an incredible amount of work. So it's a very different problem set at those higher levels, which can be compounded by being overly vested in what's best for your bureaucratic interests, even though I don't think any military leaders would define themselves that way. I think that just naturally happens a lot of the time.
Yeah, I'd talk to the where did these senior leaders come from since they were so adaptable as junior leaders question. Then I want to circle back around to Congress a bit because I think that's a great point as well. I think the first thing that would be helpful is that senior leaders collectively, and having been one of those as you have, need to realize that is a vulnerability, that there is the where you stand depends upon where you sit problem. And if you get plucked out of the environment in the field and you get put into a certain job in the Pentagon, all of a sudden your world becomes defending that particular program, and sometimes against logic and sometimes against better ideas that come from elsewhere. And there's legions of examples of that. We found examples of that in World War II. We found examples of that in the current wars. And so I think senior leaders need to continue to be reminded and be refreshed on the reality that how do we take a fresh look at this problem, and how is my job? I remember years ago, people saying my job is to make sure that the Army got 0.01% more of the budget than the Navy did. That was my primary job in the Pentagon. Probably not as a general, but that's not the outlook you want to have. And in our bureaucracies, I think, especially in Washington, tend to promote that. I think on the issue of Congress, that has more to do perhaps with peacetime innovation, and that there is not going to be any radical change in peacetime without bringing Congress on board. And you are exactly right on that. And we have not routinely done that well. And so if we're going to have institutional changes, if we're going to have major change in force structure, if we're going to make an argument for a different way of fighting, all these things, by the way, are now in the cards in the U.S. military, I'd say, as we speak today. Each of those things I just described, how we're going to develop new warfighting construct, how the services warfighting concepts are going to fit together as part of a joint warfighting concept. That's got to go to Congress, and it's got to be sold in Congress. And we have to convince, we, the U.S. military and its supporters, have to convince Congress that this is the right way to go. This is the right direction to go in, because the vested interests over there are even more powerful than they are, on the E-ring and the Pentagon. So I think there's lots to be done there, but recognizing that our history suggests, going back to generals for a moment, that generals haven't always done this well, and we've oftentimes not challenged them nearly as much as we need to, even though the results have been problematic for many, many years in a lot of cases.
Let me just add.
Oops, go ahead, Nora.
The biggest role in some ways that Congress oversees the Defense Department is by approving its budget. And because of the effects of the pandemic, the debt and deficits that the United States is running, no matter who wins the election, I think that the defense budget is about to go down, possibly precipitously, possibly as much or more than the sequestration era. That is going to force all of the military services to emphasize adaptability even more, because they're not going to be able to prepare for all the activities across the entire conflict spectrum. They're already challenged to do that today. Those constraints are going to get even tighter. That's going to make adaptability even more important.
Well, one of the many things that I liked about your book, and so I'm going to keep pitching it for you. One of the things was the internal look at the military itself, our leadership, our processes, our institutions, because that kind of introspection, well, it's something you guys do all the time with your writing, not your essay writing and other stuff, which makes huge contributions to the thoughtfulness of the national security arena. So, thanks for that. But it's sometimes easy to point outside the profession and say, well, wait a minute, what about the civil leadership? What about the civil military relationship? What about the grand strategy and strategy? Hey, these are important questions. But you focus on internally on the profession. And I think that's really been, this will be a very contributory book. But I want to ask that question though anyway. We got it from one of the participants here. What about adaptability at the highest levels? I mean, the military doesn't deploy itself. Our civilian institutions and civil leaders use the military instrument of power to achieve strategic aims. And what we do is within that context. So I wondered, what, again, outside the context of your book, but what do you think about adaptation at that most senior strategic level? What conclusions have you drawn from your research?
Well, adaptability among the nation's most senior leaders, military or elected, is going to be ever increasingly important, again, because of the environment that General Barno described earlier. The senior most political officials in the country operate in that context as well. But we chose to focus the book on the things that the military does because we're concerned once a war starts, the military has a lot of jurisdiction to decide how it fights. Things like doctrine and technology and how it prepares its leaders are things that the military controls, that it really doesn't have to take a lot of specific direction from civilian leaders. Certainly they do in wartime. The civilian leaders set the parameters, they set the mission and tell the military forces what to execute. But we found in our research, and we are concerned going forward, that even the military advice in those areas was often very flawed. That doesn't excuse civilian leaders from any mistakes that they made, and they certainly made many in the wars both in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I think sometimes it's a little too tempting for those in the military to focus on the problems, which are legitimate problems at the civilian and political level and at that grand strategic level, as a way of not turning inward and saying, what parts of it did we get wrong? And so that's one of the reasons we wanted to focus on that.
No, I would agree. I think that there's an onus on the military to be able to critically look at itself, even during times of war, and say, we need to change course. And then make that recommendation forcefully to the civilian leadership, who ultimately have, the authority and the responsibility to make a decision. We don't go into this particular aspect of the Iraq War, but it's a fairly well-known fact, and it's been covered extensively in other writings, that for the better part of 3.5 years or more, the U.S. military approach in Iraq from 2003, when the insurgency started, until at least late 2006, early 2007, was failing. And again, we talk about that in detail when we profile General Casey and his particular time in the leadership there. But the U.S. military as a whole knew that that was true. The Joint Chiefs of Staff knew that that was true. The leaders of each of the services and the theater commander knew that the strategy was not succeeding there. Yet the military, the inside, institution of the U.S. military, didn't go to the president and say, we need to change our approach and do X. And as we know, a good bit of that came from outside advice that ultimately convinced the president to move to a counterinsurgency strategy, and he sent in General Petraeus with a newly developed counterinsurgency strategy to do that in early 2007. That didn't come from the organic, wisdom of the U.S. military saying, we're not on track with this. We need to fix this, as a corporate body, and that's disturbing, because that suggests that the experts in this field can't recognize failure and problems and make recommendations for change to the civilian leadership. And again, that's a single case, but it's of grave concern because of how momentous it was and what it signified about the senior leadership in the military. Again, not to be too critical, but that's our business. Senior military leaders, the business of war is our business, like the business of medicine is doctors, and the business of law is for lawyers. And so we are the corporate knowledge and the corporate wisdom of the nation in that regard. And we have a big responsibility there.
Well, your framework of doctrine and technology and leadership is a good framework, but given what both of you said about the breadth of change, the breadth of technological change that's coming as a result of the fourth industrial revolution, the ethical or moral dimension of war is also a portion of war that's going to change significantly. And I'm going to ask a question. You're not allowed to throw it back at me because I'm the moderator. But what have you, I'm sure the two of you, given who you are, have talked about the requirement once we get more AI, more autonomous systems, more autonomous lethal systems, more big data and use of data. What's going to be the ethical adaptability requirement for our leaders, both theater and tactical?
Well, you said we can't throw it back to you, but you are the expert in this field. But we have talked about it. It doesn't play a big role in the book, because we're focusing more on change within the military. But obviously, these technologies and the direction in which they're going will have huge ethical and moral dimensions going forward. One of the things we've talked about, and that I don't like, but I think is the direction that we're going in, is that we will all be forced to abide by whatever moral and ethical constraints the least constrained belligerent is using. If we go into a war with an adversary who is a totalitarian or authoritarian state like China or Russia that may not have many moral or ethical concerns about pre-delegating lethal authority to drone swarms, for example, that can self-organize and rapidly take out not just our forces, but possibly our support lines and even potentially threaten the US homeland. Because the advantages you get from doing that would be so great, because the human mind can't keep up with swarms of artificial and AI and machine learning systems that are moving literally at light speed to reorganize and redeploy. We may be forced, if we are in a conflict where that's being done, to abide by those same rules, the least restrictive rules that may challenge some of the moral and ethical frameworks we have in a democracy put in place. And that concerns me greatly, that the the needs of war fighting in a high-scale conflict, no matter how unlikely that may seem, may require us to throw overboard some of the moral and ethical principles that we hold most dear as a nation.
Yeah, I think we can't stick our head in the sand on this. I think it is going to be a problem. It is going to be challenged. Our adversaries are going to be much less restrictive and much less concerned about this, frankly, than we will be. And I think we need to start thinking now and building alternative options now for the use of lethal autonomous systems, because rather than have to make this decision under immense pressure in the first days or weeks of a war, we need to think through the various levels that we may have to put in place, all the way down to pretty significant delegation of lethal autonomous authority to weaponry out there, because the speed of decision making is going to move so quickly that humans are probably not going to be able to be cognizant and aware of all those decisions in real time. So I think we've got to look at that closely. Also, realistically, again, as Dr. Bensahel said, our history also suggests that we have been in major conflicts that are existential, fairly robust in terms of how we applied force against our adversaries, to include against civilian populations, World War II being a case in point, fire bombings in Germany and in Japan, and then culminating with the atomic bomb against 2 Japanese cities. And so we have, without much compunction, moved rapidly in that direction in a war that was existential in the past. I'm not sure that we would be restrained in our ability to use that force in similar ways. And we'll probably be able to be more discriminate in the future, but it may not be all at the moment in human hands. We may actually build the capabilities in advance to be able to delegate that down should we get in a situation where we need to do that. Time to think about that is now, as you point out, not when the war starts.
Well, I got time for a couple of quick questions. I got one from Harry, who has served with you, Dave, in the Wolfhounds as a fist. And so he just wanted to compliment you on the cover of the book being a howitzer, not an infantryman. So I need to not to speak on
the
Harry's
red legs
behalf.
are delighted out there. I've gotten that feedback from a lot of people. They don't go beyond the front cover, I might note, but they love the front cover.
We can take no credit for the cover, the press design. That we think it's beautiful, but it does set some infantry folks, make them quite upset at us for that.
Well, you talk about mission command, which again, this is really an important aspect, but it seems, at least in my experience, that you have the junior leaders saying, we want mission command, we want to use our initiative. We have senior leaders who say, use your initiative, use your initiative. Where's the gap there? Why do we have the problem that we have if everybody wants mission command?
Well, I think part of it is that there's, and we've written about this in our column of War on the Rocks a couple times in the past as well. There is a peacetime mentality in all of our services, not just the Army, where there's a tendency to have a compliance-based culture where you've got to go through a number of mandatory training requirements. We wrote when we did a piece on this a number of years ago that the Army has managed to carve down the number of mandatory training days for a company commander from over 400 to merely 270 plus, both of which are impossible to execute. And so there's this expectation that you have to do, and it's prescribed in your peacetime training regimen, that then when you get to combat, you're supposed to be able to set all that aside and make decisions on the fly and be smart about it, and be able to judge risk and be able to balance out the requirements of your troops with your mission. You've got to build that in peacetime. And again, we need to build that in our garrison training. With the Army in the last couple of years have actually started to make some good moves to strip some of these relatively absurd restrictions out of the peacetime environment. But I think that contributes to that gap between, what company commanders hear, what the audio is and what the video is what one of a junior officer told us one time. The audio and the video don't agree with what I'm hearing from my leadership. And sometimes that's not at the 2-star level or 3-star level. Maybe it's at the colonel level or the major level or lieutenant colonel level out there.
Yeah, there's usually a problem in all organizations. This actually isn't unique to the military, that people at the bottom want to change things, people at the top want to change things, but what becomes known as middle management, the middle layers in the military, we don't call it that, of course, but you're thinking about some more senior field grade officers who are very often the most resistant to change. Part of it is because of the incentives that they face. If you're a battalion commander that's going on to an NTC rotation, for example, and you have a couple of really bright people who want to do something different, who want a broadening assignment, for example, as their next way to go, or want to take some time off to do that, even within the military system, very often they get told they can't because that might reflect on the unit at its NTC rotation, for example. And you get lots and lots of examples like that we hear because junior leaders often confide in us because we've written about this and we want to be able to amplify their voices. So part of it is that the people who are those field grade officers and leaders need to remember what they were like when they were in those more junior positions and be able to take a little bit more risk on their behalf in order to do what's right for the people who work underneath beneath them. We think that's something that also needs to happen a whole lot more than it does. When we talk to junior leaders and they complain to us about this, we usually end our conversations with them by looking them in the eye and saying, don't be that guy. When you get to that point, it may look very different to you as well. And you need to remain committed to encouraging prudent risk-taking, to trying to strip away some of the regulations and training that make the least sense, even if it does mean more risk for your own career and your own career performance.
So last question. Some people have said some of the innovations we had in the post 9/11 wars, like the asymmetric warfare group, the joint headquarters for IED, the rapid fielding initiative, that these were examples of adaptability on the institutional side. Others have looked at it as an example of the institutions being unable to adapt, and so you have to create these new things. How do you guys fall out on that?
Yeah, we actually wrote about that in the book, and we said that those need to be empowered and energized and resourced and given more authority, because they have proven to be successful in the bigger bureaucratic structures are going to be extraordinarily, if not impossible, to actually take down and make nimble. The Army has now gone in the opposite direction. It's now inactivating the asymmetric warfare group, which we got to visit as part of our research for the book. It's now going away next summer. The rapid equipping force is going away. The Red Team University at Leavenworth has now been notified they're going to be stood down. I think, though, and we both believe these are moves in the wrong direction. So you've got to have those pioneers out there breaking the ice, breaking new ground, showing how it can be done. Stripping them out of the system is not going to make the system more nimble. It's going to have, I'm afraid, the opposite effect.
Yeah, absolutely. Those organizations exist because the regular structures didn't do what they needed to do under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. So we're both very disappointed, although perhaps not surprised, that when those circumstances change, and especially as budgets get tighter, that they're going to be on the chopping block because they exist to circumvent the regular system. But as General Barno said, they provide absolutely essential adaptability to the force. We would wish that these decisions would be reversed, and we think that they need to be encouraged. Any pieces that encourage adaptability, thinking in new ways, we think need to be nurtured and fostered, not abolished.
So I'm going to turn it over to General Swan now. I want to say thanks to everyone out there in the digisphere who has submitted questions that helped us out a lot in the dialogue. And thanks to Nora and Dave. But Nora, I have to say, hanging around with two airborne rangers talking about intellectual stuff really shows maybe you have some more work to do on your own adaptability.
Let me add my thanks to Dave and Nora as well on behalf of all of us at AUSA. Both of you have made a huge contribution with this book. It's been interesting over the last 6 to 9 months. There's been several books that have come out, some that we've presented here at AUSA, that are very, very thoughtful. And I think it's a kind of a renaissance going on right now of looking at these institutions with some great insights. So thank you both very much. And Jim, thank you as well for moderating today's session. Before we close, I did want to inform you of some upcoming AUSA events that will be of interest to many of you. One is on the 10th of November, we'll be hosting a virtual job fair. We've done a number of in-person job fairs, but under the current conditions, we'll do a virtual one. You can get information on that at the AUSA website at www.ausa.org. Our next AUSA Thought Leaders webinar, like the one today, will be on the 12th of November, and we'll have a panel of distinguished authors who have written books on the Vietnam War, and I'm sure we'll get some discussion about adaptation from that group of authors. Our next AUSA Noon report will be at noon on the 18th of November, and will feature the Army Deputy Chief of Staff G8, Lieutenant General Jim Pasquarette. He'll be talking about programming and budgeting in the future years for the U.S. Army. These are some great speakers, and we have many more to come throughout the fall and into the winter. And we'd ask you to go to the AUSA website to register for those events. We've got a terrific lineup ahead of us. And finally, we want to thank all of you that are AUSA members for your membership. And for those who have not yet joined us, again, you can go to the AUSA website and join us. We cannot do these events. We cannot support America's Army without your membership. So membership is very important, and we'd ask you to join us. And if you've already joined, we'd ask you to renew your membership as we go forward. Again, thanks to our speakers and to all of you who joined us today. What a great discussion about our Army and the future of America's Army. Thank you for attending, and have a great Army Day.